Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are really excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate the almost new in paperback Outlawed. It's tonight is a pre-order event for the book that is coming out on February 15th. Written by Anna North. We are also joined by Molly Wizenberg, and I'll introduce Molly first. Molly is the author of A Homemade Life, Delancey, and most recently, The Fixed Stars. She's also the James Beard award-winning blog writer of Orangette. She has written for The Washington Post, The Guardian, Savoir, and Bon Appetit, and she also co-hosts the podcast Spilled Milk with chef Brandon Pettit. Wizenberg co-founded the award-winning Seattle restaurants Delancey and Essex. So welcome, Molly. Thank you for being with us tonight. And the person of the hour is Anna North. She is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and the author of 3 novels, Outlawed, the book we are celebrating tonight, as well as America Pacifica and The Life and Death of Sophie Stark, which received a Lambda Literary Award in 2016. It was also another Charis favorite. She has been a writer and editor at Jezebel, BuzzFeed, Salon, in the New York Times, and is now a senior reporter at Vox. She grew up in Los Angeles and now lives in Brooklyn, New York, in a brand new house. She just moved. So we're delighted to get to do this with you. So folks, wherever you're watching from, we love it when you, make yourself at home in the chat. Feel free to ask questions. Molly will be trying to pull those into the conversation. So you can do that by clicking the Ask a Question button or tab at the bottom center of the screen. Or you can put a question in the chat and I'll put it in the right place. So welcome to both of you. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Hi, Anna. It is such a pleasure to do this event with you in celebration of your soon-to-be paperback. And I wondered, will you start us off with a reading?
Yes, thanks so much. I'm going to sneak this and 2 programming notes. One, first of all, thank you so much to Molly and ER and Charis. I'm so psyched to be here, and thank you all of you for coming. I did just move, so I usually have like a nice Zoom background with books by people that I like and like a little plant, and now I don't have that because we're not really all that well set up. It's also my kid's bedtime, so his dad will be putting him to bed, and as I was telling Molly earlier, my child might be the loudest person I've ever met. So if you hear loud yelling, it's because he's 3 and he doesn't really like bedtime and he does like using his voice. So just like try to, I feel like you've all probably heard loudness on Zoom calls before during this pandemic. So this is Outlawed. I'm just going to read from the very beginning, just super briefly before we chat. In the year of our Lord, 1894, I became an outlaw. Like a lot of things, it didn't happen all at once. First, I had to get married. I felt lucky on the day of my wedding dance. At 17, I wasn't the first girl in my class to marry, but I was one of them, and my husband was a handsome boy from a good family. He had 3 siblings like me, and his mama was one of 7. Did I love him? We used to say we loved our beaus, my girlfriends and I. I remember spending hours talking about his broad shoulders, his awkward but charming dancing, the bashful way he always said my name. The first few months of my marriage were sweet ones. My husband and I were hungry for each other all the time. In 9th form, when the girls and boys were separated to prepare us for married life, Mrs. Spencer had explained to us that it would be our duty to lie with our husbands regularly so that we could have children for baby Jesus. We already knew about the children part. We had read Burton's Lessons of the Infant Jesus Christ every year since 3rd form, so we had heard about how God sent the great flu to cleanse the world of evil, just like he'd sent the flood so many centuries before. We knew that baby Jesus had appeared to Mary of Texarkana after the sickness had killed 9 of every 10 men, women, and children from Boston to California, and struck a covenant with her. If those who remained were fruitful and peopled the world in his image, he would spare them further sickness, and they and their descendants forever after would be precious to him. But in 9th form, we learned about lying with our husbands, how we should wash beforehand and put perfume behind our ears, how we should breathe slowly to relax our muscles and try to look our husbands in the eyes, how we'd bleed. Don't worry, she said then, smiling at us. It only hurts in the beginning. After a while, you'll start to like it. There's nothing more joyful than 2 people joining together to make a child. My husband did not know what to do at first, but he took his responsibilities seriously, and what he lacked in experience he made up for in ardor. We lived with his parents while he saved for a house. In the mornings, his mother made little jokes about how soon I'd be eating for two. During the day, I still attended births with my mama. I was the eldest and the only one who actually wanted to learn about breech births and morning sickness and childbed fever, so I was the one who would take over for Mama when she got too old. When I came on rounds with my new wedding ring, the mothers-to-be winked and teased me. "It's good you're learning about all this now," said Alma Bunting, 40 years old, pregnant with her sixth child and suffering from hemorrhoids. "Then you won't be surprised when it's your turn." I just laughed. I was not like my friend Ula, who had 8 baby names picked out, 4 boys and 4 girls. When I was 10 and my sister B was 2 months old, my mama had gone to bed and stayed there for a year. So I had already been a mama. I had changed a baby, fed her from a bottle when mama couldn't nurse, soothed her at night when I was still young enough to be afraid of the dark. I was not in a rush to do it again. I knew from working with mama that sometimes it could take months, even for a young girl like me, and I was happy to sleep with my new husband and still sneak off sometimes to drink Juneberry wine behind the Petersons' barn with Ula and Susie and Mary Alice, and not have to worry about anyone except for me. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So this book is so I read a little bit about, I read a lot of the reviews when this book came out, and I was intrigued to learn that you didn't initially set this book in the 1890s. And I wonder, it made me think a lot about this dystopian society that you've created here, and the fact that most of the dystopian societies that I think, at least these days, we think about are set in the future. And what an interesting project it must have been to set this in the past, and sort of in the old West of what would have been the former United States in the book. And so I wondered, how did you arrive at the time and that sort of setting in time? And what was it like to reimagine the past as opposed to kind of building a society in the future?
Yeah, such a good question. So I always, I'll back up even further. When I was very first starting to work on this, I was sort of writing these short stories about like these really sad farmers. And I wasn't exactly sure what they were so sad about or what had happened to them, but I was really interested in just sort of this like agrarian landscape where there wasn't a lot of technology. And when I was very first writing the stories, I think I thought of them as in the future and post some sort of terrible war or some, climate change, something that's like wiped out, cities, for example. And then as I sort of like was refining these and turning them into something longer, and sort of eventually hit on the Western, which we can talk about more. I knew there came a point when I was like, I know I want this to be an alternate history. Like I decided I didn't, because my first novel is set in the future and it's a dystopia. And I decided I didn't want to do that again for a lot of reasons. One of them is just like, I'm actually like have a hard time with the future now and with dystopia. Like I loved the Emily St. John Mandel book so much, Station 11, and I like can't bring myself to watch the show, even though I know it's great.
I've been having such an interesting time trying to watch it, having read the book.
Yeah.
I'm only on like episode 3, and I'm finding it to be, I preferred to imagine it in my head. Anyway, but yes, go on. Sorry.
I mean, I'm just like frankly afraid to watch it. I feel like it's going to be too real. That's why I had to stop watching The Handmaid's Tale. Like obviously I love that book and I tried to watch it and I thought the show was really good. But like I think I was watching it like during when they were trying to repeal the ACA and it was just like it's also too real. So there were just a lot of reasons why I wanted to kind of mine the past. And I also like I was interested in that alternate concept too, where I was like, I'm not gonna imagine like the worst world I can imagine. I'm just gonna imagine a different world. So like in the world of the book, for example, a lot of things are sort of, worse than they are in our current world or than in real life 1894, but like a few things are better. For example, like for women who have a lot of kids, they can, achieve this sort of autonomy and respect and do what they want. And there's like not a lot of real pressure around marriage. So just like I wanted the mores to just be different as opposed to just straight up more restrictive in all ways. But I wasn't sure at the beginning, like, when do I want this alternate history to be? And, how slowed down has technological change become? So I wrote a whole draft that's set in 1954. And it's pretty similar. And I turned it in to my agent and I was like, what do you think of this? And she's like, okay, I like this, but the timeline is really confusing. Like they're still riding horses and wearing cowboy hats and, there's no cars or anything. But it's 1954. Like what's happening here?
What marked it as being 1954?
I think the first line was in the year of our Lord, 1954.
Okay. That does it.
And then there's a few, I think in the book, there's a few other times when I say the year. And in all those cases, it was like in the 50s. And I think I always had in mind that in the year 1830 is when this reality splits from our reality, because in 1830, there was actually a flu pandemic in the real world. And it was pretty bad, but obviously it wasn't as bad as in the book or now. But I wanted that to be the break point. And so originally I thought like, okay, like things start to diverge in 1830 and then like just everything gets like glacially slow. And so by 1954, there's still no cars. There's still no, electricity, very little electricity. There's just been, nothing on that scale. And my agent, Julie, was like, this is needlessly confusing. Would anything have to change if you just change the date? And I had to change like one thing, I think. And then I did realize it was way better. Like it made more sense.
That's so interesting, especially since you had imagined sort of this great divide happening in 1830. Okay. Well, so I'm, you mentioned the Old West. I'm really, as a writer, I'm interested in the way that I get to kind of work out my obsessions through my writing and go deep in rabbit holes of things that I'm into. No matter how random they may seem to other people. And I wondered, what were some of the obsessions or the aspects of pop culture or books or movies? What were things that you found yourself kind of using this book as a way to dive deep into?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wasn't actually a huge Westerns fan before this. Like I'd seen like the contemporary, like I'd seen like Hell or High Water, and that's like a great movie, but I hadn't even watched Deadwood, and I actually wouldn't watch Deadwood until I was like completely done with this book because I was like, it's going to bias me. It's going to get in my head. But there were a couple of things. One is just that I was homesick. Like I missed California. I miss the West. And obviously, like the landscapes in this book are pretty different from Southern California, where I'm from. But it was this thing where actually originally when I was starting to write the book, I was setting it like in the woods here in the Northeast, and it like kind of wasn't coming together. And like there wasn't a richness. And then as soon as I moved it west, I felt like I was able to access that richness a little better. And there were also like a couple of sort of cultural touchstones. One that I've talked about a little bit before is Crazy Cat. I am a longtime fan of the Crazy Cat comics. My grandfather and then my father also were obsessed with them. So I, from childhood have read these. And it's a Western. So, it's if you haven't read them, go read them. They're so bizarre. Now my kid loves them and it's horrible because it's like tiny, tiny font. He's like, read this to me. I'm like, no, I'll have no eyesight and it's going to take me 90 years. No. But it's about a cat who's in love with a mouse, and the mouse hates the cat, and they live in Coconino County, Arizona, and there's like red rocks and cacti everywhere, and there's a sheriff named Officer Pup, and he gets into like adventures, and so it's this very sort of like classical Western setup, and at the same time it's also like a queer story. So the cat's gender is pretty fluid, and sometimes he uses he pronouns and sometimes she uses she pronouns. And George Harriman, who wrote and drew it, like really wouldn't be pinned down on the cat's gender, even though these comics were coming out in the teens in the 1920s, a long time ago. And then there's there's really interesting criticism on Crazy Cat too, on Crazy Cat and gender and race, because George Harriman also was someone who passed as white during his life, although he had Black ancestry. There's just like a lot of like interesting complications when you dig into this like on its surface, like very silly comic strip. And so I think that was part of what made me think, oh, like the Western can be this thing that's really deep and can be this thing that, you know, it doesn't have to be like Clint Eastwood, I guess. And also that the West can be this sort of liminal space where some rules can get broken, and not just like rules of not robbing banks, I guess. And then there's this wonderful book too, that I usually would have behind me, but I don't have it right now, called Lieutenant None, which are the memoirs of a person who was born in Spain a little before 1600 and assigned female at birth and sent to a convent by her family, which was like common for like noble daughters at the time. Like, we'll just wait for her to get married off. We'll send her to the convent and see what happens. And then at a certain point, she's like, never mind this. And she cuts off all of her hair, fashions her like nun's habit into some pants, changes her identity, and ships off to the New World, and then lives for decades on and off as a man. Went by various names, including Antonio, had a lot of adventures, became like a criminal and stabbed a lot of people. Just this sort of swashbuckling life. And I'd known about this book for a long time. And
what is the book again?
It's called Lieutenant None. They're her actual memoirs. It's in translation. I mean, or I never know really how to identify this person pronoun wise, because she did sometimes live fully as a woman, and she lived in convents, and then sometimes he totally lived as a man. There's some evidence that he died as a man, that he was going by Antonio when he died, but it's like so many centuries after that we don't really have access to like what would this person prefer as pronouns in the modern era. But it's great, it's fascinating. Like, it's the actual diary of this person who lived in the 1600s. And I'd been really interested in it for a long time. And then as soon as I was starting to think about Westerns, I was like, I got to reread this. Even though it's not set in the US, it's set in Peru and Chile, but it's also, it's like that space of colonialism, which also applies to the American West. So it's like a similar type of environment, and sort of the kind of, the kind of alt Western, I guess, that I wanted to try to create.
Speaking of pronouns and of gender and alternate histories, I was struck by how seemingly effortlessly, which I take it means that you worked quite hard at it, how effortlessly the kid gets to remain without pronouns. And also the way in which who the kid is, the kid's gender, it is never given any kind of naming language. And there is really no label or name that's put on the relationships that the female identifying people at Hole in the Wall have. Or on the relationship between the main character and another character. So I'm really interested in your allowing that to be without language. Will you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I did think a ton about this. I mean, I'll start with the kid. So I think it was like early in the process of drafting the book, I gave some early pages to my writing group, and trying to remember now, like, because the pronouns of the gang members went through a few different iterations, and I'm trying to remember exactly what stage I was at with the kid. But I remember a friend of mine was like, it would be interesting if the kid was just the kid. I think that the place we were in was I was trying to initiate Ada into this world. So the main character, Ada, like, she's young, she's pretty naive, she's grown up in a small town, she doesn't know a lot of people. How do I initiate her into a world where people behave really differently than the world that she's from? And I don't want her to be mean to them, but I also don't want her to be artificially like she knows everything. She doesn't know anything.
Yeah, I found myself thinking, well, would she even have language for what, who knows what these relationships would have been called?
Right. And so she does. So for example, she doesn't really have language for like some of the queer relationships that she sees, but she's seen them before because she's seen like women be in relationships with women back in her hometown, or she's seen, certain like clandestine things happen. And for that, I did think about history, and I thought about, there have been plenty of times and plenty of places where various types of queer relationships, right, have sort of been like tacitly tolerated as long as like, especially for men, or as long as you get married, or, like there's really been sort of like a going in and out of how society sort of, how much people are willing to look the other way. So I thought about that with Ada. And then for the kid and pronouns, it was Tony. It was Tony Tulin Moody who was like the kid. The kid should just be the kid. He now disavows this, but it was him. Um, and um, and I was like, oh, that's a great idea. I wonder if it can work. And then it worked easily. Like it was not difficult for me to not use pronouns. And of course, there are people today who don't use pronouns. It's not as common, but there are definitely people who don't. So it's not like this identity that has never happened before.
Mhm.
And it seemed to just really fit. And now when I describe the kid, I say like, well, today, if the kid was like transported into our world, probably the kid would identify as non-binary, but also the kid isn't in our world and they don't have the word non-binary. And I played around with the with pronouns for the other members of the gang too. Um, and it ended up that they all use she except for the kid. They use she, her. But there were drafts where some of them didn't, and that was in flux for a while. And even the kids' pronouns, like there were times in the editing process where someone would say, should the kid use they, them? And I thought about it a lot. Um, and it ended up just feeling like no, that this is what the kid uses. Like those aren't the kid's pronouns. You know?
It would have struck me as very contemporary, even though I don't know, but it does seem like for sure there must have been people using they them pronouns before it was something that we all recognized. But yeah, it was so I was really struck by how seamlessly you did that, and by how well Ada is such an interesting character in her combination of being naive and in many ways believing that she believing the idea that she has failed by not being able to have a child. And yet at the same time, she is very wise and she has a certain openness to her when she encounters this this really beautiful scene when she gets to the hole in the wall, and it's not your typical band of outlaws sitting around spitting and swaggering and whatnot. I mean, they're flower garlands or like capes of flowers. Anyway, she walks a really interesting line between being naive and being of the culture she is from, but also being open and wise. Will you talk about where Ada came from?
Yeah, thank
How
you.
she came to be?
Yeah. I mean, one thing is like, I think part of the answer to that is that I think the hole in the wall gang themselves are actually like, in a lot of ways, what she arrives at is this place that's really great.
Yeah.
So it's like no wonder they're compelling to her, because they're kind of mean, they test her in various ways, and like obviously like they live a hard life, but they're also like fundamentally accepting in a way that like she's not experienced a society that's been accepting. So I like to think of it like almost like it's a little utopia, like she
Mhm.
arrives at this place that's actually really wonderful. And so I think that's part of it for her. But in terms of her character, like it was tough sometimes because again, like I wanted there to be a realistic level of her not understanding things. And like later in the book, there's points when she's like kind of a white knight, and she like does some like white savior stuff that isn't great. And like it like was important to me to have that in there. But at the same time, yeah, I want her to have this openness to experience. I wanted her to, um, you know, be someone that fundamentally cares about other people. I wanted the audience to be able to fundamentally root for her. So it was this hard balance. I mean, I thought a lot about, even though she has so little life experience, what is the life experience that she has that she is kind of bringing to the table? And a lot of times I would think about her mother, who's been a midwife in this small town for her career. And if you're a midwife, like you've seen a lot. And also, I thought about I thought about who midwives have been historically, and it's been a racially diverse group. It's been also a group like super diverse in terms of what are the services that they do. So midwives used to do like pretty much every kind of medicine under the sun, and then also a bunch of stuff that isn't medicine. So my thought is that she's been raised by someone who, like, really her life has taught her a lot about humanity. And then Ada herself is already she's already an apprentice midwife by the time she comes to the hole in the wall. So even if she doesn't understand, different kinds of relationships, or even if she doesn't really understand, maybe some of her own racism even, or like the racism of the society where she's been raised, she has sort of like a reverence for people and their bodies, and a fundamental sense that people deserve a bodily autonomy, even though she doesn't necessarily believe that for herself. Like she does think she's a failure because she's infertile. But I think a lot of us don't, extend to others more grace than we give ourselves. And I think she's one of those people. And yeah, I think that she has this sense that people deserve a kind of self-determination and a kind of freedom. And I think that comes in part innately and in part sort of from the experiences that she's had.
I understand that that your son hadn't been born when you were writing the book, or maybe you were pregnant with him. And I wondered how that experience informed, or are there ways that you can identify that it affected the book? The experience of that in your own body as you were writing about this woman who is who is circling ideas about bodies and babies and fertility all the time.
I mean, the joke answer is that my son made the book a lot shorter, but it's not totally a joke. Like people, I frequently, like on Instagram, people will say like, "Oh, wow, it ended kind of abruptly," and yeah, when I got pregnant, I was sort of like, "Okay, I have 40 weeks to finish this up," and then he was a week early, and I feel like I really would have finished a draft. I mean, a week early isn't even really early, right? Like that's still a full term pregnancy, but I think I would have finished or been really close. But then that like week's worth of work probably took 4 or 5 months. And it just had to move more quickly. So, those parts at the end are parts that I wrote when I was already a parent. But I was writing this whole book at like a real time of flux in my family and just like physical life as a physical human. Like I started it when we were sort of talking about, are we going to have a child? And then I was working on it while we were trying for me to get pregnant. And then when I was pregnant, and then I finished it and I was revising it after he was born. And, I think the parts that it affected most to have him there were and I've written a little bit about this, but the parts where I describe people getting good medical care, there's parts of the book where people get bad medical care, but then, there's also parts where it talks about the kind of clinic basically that Ada might set up. And when I was writing about that, I did think about when I was giving birth, for example, what did I want that I didn't get, or what did I actually get that was really good, or just how would I want to be cared for in this extreme situation of having a child, or one of the many other extreme situations that we find ourselves in with our bodies? I mean, I almost completely finished this before the pandemic started, but obviously, like, that's been, put a lot of people in a lot of really different extreme situations. So, I thought a lot, even before I had him, I thought a lot about sort of care in the context of the book, and I think I was sort of even more interested in that once he was born. And the other thing too is that I found I couldn't like look at the scenes that were about death and childbirth, or it was like really hard. I wrote most of those before, either before I was pregnant or when I was pregnant, but I never used to be freaked out by descriptions of that, and now I can barely read them, and also like can barely read or watch anything that has children in peril. And it actually feels like, I don't know if you have this experience, but I feel like I used to be tough and now I'm so soft. And I actually like, I worry about it sometimes with my writing. Like, am I going to be able to like have bad things happen to my characters still? But I did experience this like incredible softening and like lowering of tolerance when he was born.
Yeah. Yeah. I was really struck. I was really struck by by how unflinching and how vivid the character's embodied experience felt to me. If a character gets hit by a bullet, your ability to put us as readers inside of that, and your ability also to live inside the nuances of your characters' minds and emotions, was so captivating. It's interesting. I tend to be really drawn to fiction where not a lot happens and we're in people's minds a lot. And your book, like, does both. There's so much that happens, and these characters, I really felt what it was like to be inside their minds. So I don't have a question there. I just wanted to say that was something I really appreciated.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the sort of most embodied sections of the book, even if they're pretty gross, were really fun to write. I mean, there's a scene where they remove a bullet, and that scene was very interesting for me because I had to figure out like what would they do, like what substances were available, like what would be the highest standard of medical care that you could provide in these like very straitened circumstances. And I did a lot of Googling that I'm now worried I'm on like a watch list for, like how to remove a bullet in the field.
Yes.
But yeah, like all of that was fun for me. And I think like there's something about the body that's really specific. So it's, it feels grounding for me often to write about things that happen to people's bodies. It's often so hard for me to figure out what's happening to people's minds. Or also like I feel like as a writer, I really struggle with like with rooms or houses. I really struggle to like moving people and knowing like where is this room and what does the house look like. But I feel a lot more confident with people's bodies and more like, okay, well now her arm hurts. So her arm hurt in that scene, so she's still gonna be healing in this. Like I feel like more connected to it for some reason.
Oh, that's so interesting. Oh, that's really interesting to me. Especially, thinking about the end of the book, sort of, there's a big like fight scene, and just thinking about sort of the logistics of that scene versus like a cooking scene where two of the characters are having a conversation while cooking. Anyway, I don't want to give anything away, but I have to go back to the idea, to the theme of gender. I was really struck by, so there's a dance that happens as part of an Easter celebration. And it is, the gang is in, a mainstream society town. And I was really struck when we arrived at the dance. And it was like the thing to do for the men to be wearing dresses and the women to be wearing men's clothes, dungarees and whatnot. And I was really interested in the choice that you made to give this otherwise very straight-laced, gender-wise society this really unlikely moment. And I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, so this Mothering Monday, the sort of Easter week celebration that you're talking about, I really base that on medieval festivals. So
Okay.
I've been obsessed for years and years and years since like I was in college with accounts of festivals in medieval Europe. And there were lots of times when these festivals would, like, the concept would often be a sort of reversal. So, for example, they would have like the local lord put on the clothes of a beggar and ride through town on a donkey, and people would mock him. Um, but then also there would be cross-dressing, or there would be partner switching, or the norms would be lifted for a day, so people could have premarital sex when they wouldn't. That would usually be way more frowned upon. A lot of things would be reversed in this way, and so I've been fascinated with those for years. And historians will talk about them as like almost like a purge, that like this was a restrictive to society, and then they're just allowed to like let loose and do all these things that they want to do, but they're not allowed to do. But it's also like this reminder that like, and I think Lieutenant Nunn also functions as a reminder about this, that there's a strain of thinking that gender fluidity, or being openly trans, for example, are very new. You'll see TERFs say this, or you'll see conservatives sometimes say that, or there's just this idea that like these are new things. It's just very hard for society to accept. I don't know if I can get my head around it, type deal. And like, of course, we have all these examples from history of gender not being like a fixed point, right? And of people wanting to play with their gender, and even people who lead very straight-laced lives, otherwise playing with their gender. Even like, you look at Shakespeare plays where like the entire cast is male, and like, that obviously, like, were those straight-laced people or straight people, in their ordinary lives? I don't know. But this is a very mainstream entertainment, right, that the queen would go to. And yet it's rife with cross-dressing, and and the plots acknowledge that and play with it, right? And Shakespeare's comedies are often all about gender and changing gender, and playing with gender, and people, falling in love with someone when they think they're one gender and it's revealed that they're another. So just like, I think in some ways that scene was a way for me to call back to these festivals that I'd always been really interested in. But it was also this way of saying like, look, like, people have always been like interested in playing with the way they present. Like, that's never been, that may be treated as something that's totally fringe, but it really isn't. And there are reasons that more conservative societies become invested in treating it as a really fringe thing, or treating it as something that's never happened before. But it has always happened, and it's always happening. And I think that's part of what I want. And it's also just like fun. Like, this is a fun scene to write. Like a scene with like a lot of like people putting on different outfits is just like really fun and interesting. And like, what kind of outfits would they put on? And like, someone, who's maybe really not comfortable, a man who's really not comfortable in women's clothes, like, what would it be like? And like, the guy who wins like the Mother of the Year award, what's he going to look like? Just like a fun, just a fun thing for me to write.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested too in the role that religion plays in the book. Obviously, it is a tool for controlling women, controlling society in the dominant society of the book. But it's not that cut and dried because of the kid, really. And I wondered how you decided to have religion be sort of neither nor, or if you even see that as an accurate reading here.
Yeah, I do. And that was really intentional. Like I didn't want to have the book be a story where religion is the bad guy. I wanted it to be this complex picture because I think the roles of religion in people's lives are many. I think a lot about my grandmother when she was alive. She and my mother used to have these really terrible fights because my grandmother was a Christian and my mother is an atheist. And my mom, yeah, and they would just get in these fights that like weren't actually about religion. They were about, like ancient family drama.
Mhm.
But my mother would say, like, to bait my grandmother would say, like, well, religion is the cause of all the problems in the world, and my grandmother would fight back and they would fight. But I think from both those influences, I always sort of like, uh, you know, have never wanted to like put religion in a box in my work and have always seen it as something that has very complex and sometimes conflicting influences on people and on communities. And partly just for the kid, it came really naturally to me to have the kid have this background as a preacher. Like the kid is someone who um I think the kid's like biggest strength is the kid's ability to inspire people, maybe with language. Like the kid is actually not a good planner, really. Like the kid's plans are like kind of half-baked a little bit. Um, but the kid is like a leader and really uses words and uses biblical language to accomplish that. And I
Mhm.
think like something really unlocked for me when I started having the kid quote the Bible.
Mhm.
And then it was this nice thing where it was a chance to show religion operating in a person's life in a completely different way. And of course, like we have like liberation theology, right? This is historically true too, that like, Christianity and other religions have like, had so many different ways that they become a politics. So it's not necessarily, for example, that Christianity has always and everywhere been conservative or been conservative with respect to gender or race. I mean, like just the history of religion is fascinating and many faceted. And so I wanted to get a tiny bit of that across. And I think the other thing that I'll say about this is that I also wanted to get across like the sort of complexity of science too. Like I
Mm.
didn't like my mother's a scientist and a lot of this book is really about, like Ada's real joy in learning about science and her joy in learning about the body and about biology. And I wanted that to come across. But like there's also eugenicists in the book, people
Mhm.
who, are racist scientists and use science for racism. And that's a real part of American history that I really didn't change very much and just like change the names kind of. And put in the book. And so I wanted to show that side too.
That must have been, I can tell how well researched this book is. And I wonder, God, it must have felt really twisted to be reading these or to have to go in search of these tracts, these documents from the history of eugenics, or putting accurate words into this character's mouth must have felt really challenging.
Yeah, I mean to be honest, I didn't go out and read a ton of like Francis Galton. I think that would have been like fairly troubling. I read
Yes.
about him and I read about the eugenicists and about 19th century eugenics and sort of what was happening at that particular time. But like the sad thing is like you don't have to go to the 19th century to like read like fake race science. And so I didn't feel like I had to be that imaginative, unfortunately.
Mhm.
I mean, I think I struggled like as a white writer, I struggled a lot with depictions of race and racism in the book for other reasons. Like I
Mhm.
think I struggled a lot with like how is Ada like what is Ada's like position toward her own whiteness? Like, how does Ada understand racism in her world? She doesn't know much about it because she's not had to know much about it. So, what happens when she starts to learn about it? And that was difficult for me as a writer. Um,
Do you
but
think
I,
that she knew, did she know any people of color before arriving at Hole in the Wall?
Yeah, she did.
Okay.
But her town is segregated. So
Okay.
it's like, like across the river or down near the river is
Oh,
where
that's
is where
right.
Black people live in her town.
Yes.
So she's not like she hasn't grown up in an all white world, but she's grown up in a segregated world. And I can't remember. It's interesting because there were drafts of the book where I have more sort of backstory about her mother, who, like, if she was a midwife, in the real 19th century, would certainly have worked with Black women. And like now it's been so long, it's like what even ended up in the actual book. I don't know if you have that experience with your books. But that's certainly something that I thought about in terms of like Ada's backstory.
Now that you mention it, I remember you talking about the way that like a newborn baby was received by the community,
Yeah.
and it being very much the same, regardless of the baby's skin color. But that then things would change, of course, as the baby got older. Yeah. Which was such a subtle way to get that information in there.
I mean, that's
Through
another
her
place.
knowledge as the daughter of a midwife.
Yeah, I mean, it's also another place where I thought, like, okay, well, this is a world where fertility just trumps everything, but only like very temporarily. Then it doesn't, it doesn't trump anymore. But this idea that the baby being born is just like the most important thing in this world, and people just drop almost everything for that brief moment.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting hearing you talk about your decisions around religion in the book, because it makes me realize, admittedly, it's been a very long time since I read The Handmaid's Tale, watched it much more recently. But religion is it is such a cynical object in that book. Even the society that claims to use religion as part of its means of oppressing women, still has a very cynical point of view of it. And there's nothing that opposes that. And it's really interesting to see the different effect that we get when that is balanced. And it's not when the bad guys are, when there's just much more gray area for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting about The Handmaid's Tale. It's also been a long time since I've read it, and it's exactly the kind of thing that I like banned myself from reading when I was working on this book, because I was worried about being too influenced. But I do think I do, and again, I also like I haven't trying to think the last time I like heard her speak about it or anything, but I do think she had like a really particular project with that book, and I know she's said like I didn't put anything in the book that hasn't happened. That it's all not exactly like a one-to-one or whatever, but a very sort of strict commentary on, contemporary reproductive restrictions. And I think, I think my project was something really different. Like, I think what I wanted, what I didn't want was I didn't want an allegory for the kinds of things that like I cover as a journalist. Like I do not intend this book to be an allegory about abortion politics, for example, or an allegory about like infertility stigma in the present day, although certainly that exists and existed in 1894 and has continued apace, although in different ways. But what I wanted was to sort of almost like create like a laboratory, just like what would things be like if it were different. That was what was interesting to me. And just thinking, sometimes I think about like branching universes, like that sort of like 90s idea of physics. And like this is that branch of the universe. And this is how, the former United States looks then. So more so than trying to comment exactly on what we're doing now, I wanted to create this other world.
So coming back to, to the idea of dystopia, and the way in which, the dominant society that Ada comes from is quite dystopian. But then what she finds at the Hole in the Wall gang, as you said, like this is a pretty fun scene, but it's not perfect and it's not easy. It's not a clear utopia. And yet I found myself as I read it, no matter the sort of obstacles that the characters encountered, I found myself never losing hope or feeling overwhelmed by the dystopian aspects of what they were up against. And I wondered, as you were writing, I think a lot about how I feel as I'm writing. It feels like a sort of imperfect index for how I want my reader to maybe feel. And what feeling were you going for as you wrote this, or as you thought about how you wanted to leave these characters or leave the reader when they were done?
Yeah, that's a great question. I also think about how I'm feeling when I'm writing. Although I don't know if I ever feel like the way I want my readers to feel exactly, but I do think about that. I think with this, like I think something that I was going for in a lot of cases was like a sense of adventure. Like there are
Mhm.
really bad things that happen and people are badly hurt and they nearly starve and like there are really difficult conditions. But like I'll contrast it, for example. So my first book, America Pacifica, that is a dystopia, like I was really sort of like throwing a lot at the wall in terms of misery in that book and like making everything be really disgusting. Like the food is really bad, and made of jellyfish mostly, or made of like krill even. I forget now. This book seems like such a long time ago. But there's rats everywhere. There's cockroaches,
Mhm.
and like those are like the superficial things. Like
Yeah.
also people are in incredibly dire straits economically, like they're horribly overcrowded, there's incredibly bad inequality. The world has basically like been almost completely poisoned, like everything's so bad. And I think I just like really turned it up to 11 there. And I still wanted there to be a sense of adventure, but I also wanted there to be like this sense of like doom.
Mhm.
um and that book like has hopeful aspects also, but like I wanted it to be pretty dark. And I
Mhm.
really didn't want this book to be dark in the same way. Like there's certainly peril, but one of my big imperatives is that I wanted it to be fun. Like Western, like
Mhm.
I was interested in the Western as a genre. And I think one of the reasons that people like historically have turned to genre, which like what is genre fiction anymore? I think it's been really troubled, but like that boundary has been almost erased, which is all to the good. But like people turn to genre because it's fun, and because they enjoy themselves. In particular, westerns are like, you imagine yourself on a horse, like riding across like the prairie or whatever. Like it's supposed to be a good time. And
Mhm.
even I think when things are hard, I wanted that to come across. And I also, in like a more sort of like earnest way, like I wanted to show like a community that is loving, and caring to its members,
Mhm.
because I think those exist and are possible.
Mhm.
And we sometimes feel like the only defense against everything that's so terrible. So I wanted that to come across too.
Mhm. I'm glad to hear you say that you wanted it to be, or that the word fun is acceptable, because I found myself saying to someone yesterday, um, that your book was so fun.
Thank
Like
you.
I found such pleasure in the time that I was absorbed in it. And
Thank you.
and it felt, it felt a little bit, wasn't sure if it was okay for me to feel that way, because these people are going through really hard things. Anyway, I loved it.
Thank you.
Um, before we invite ER back, I wanted to ask you, what are you reading right now, or is there anything that's coming out soon that you're feeling particularly excited about?
I just read a book called Fire Season, by Lena Crow, and I'm gonna learn how to. I'm sorry, Lena, if I've messed up the pronunciation of your name, but I was so intrigued by it, and it's like one of those books that's like feels really easy to spoil. Like it's hard to describe the plot without spoiling it.
Mhm.
But it is about three people, and they are united by fire. Um,
Mm.
and it's also kind of a Western, and it's kind of set, in the 19th century. And yeah, it's hard. What can I say? It's also fun. It's a little darker, I think, than my book, but it really explores sort of people who are on the margins of society. It explores magic in a really interesting way. It plays with these sort of 19th century ideas about magic and like mesmerism and like patent medicines in like a really fun way. So that's a book that I really enjoyed recently. Jane Peck's The Verifiers is coming out really soon. I really love that book. It's like kind of a mystery. It's a literary novel, but it has like a real mystery element. And then I've also been like unpacking my books, and I like last year, basically like the last 2 years have been really like not good years for reading for pleasure, or like not good years for reading things that I don't have to read for some reason. But a book that like is on my list that I just bought because I wanted to read it and I still really want to read it, and now I just unpacked it. I'm going to read it as Call Baby. Like that's my next, like, I don't have to read this for work, but I just want to read it book. So that's like it's not exactly my next current, but close.
Terrific. Well, I see that ER has put links in the chat for those books, as well as for Lieutenant Nunn. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and for giving us all some insight into this incredibly complex and nuanced and really fun story.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful questions.
My pleasure. My pleasure. ER, do you want to lead us out?
Yeah. So thank you both so much. This was a really great conversation. And I want to encourage folks to go ahead and click that teal button. Technically, you are pre-ordering the book because the publication date got pushed back a little bit. And Anna was kind enough to keep this date. And so we didn't have to, jumble our schedules too much. So the book officially comes out on February 15th, but you can order it now. We will ship it to you the second it arrives to us. So just click that teal button. You, of course, can still buy the hardback if you want, but we are celebrating the paperback today. And you can also buy Molly's book, The Fixed Stars, or any of her other books at charisbooksandmore.com. And I did, as Molly mentioned, put the other links to all of the books that Anna mentioned in the chat. I'm going to go check out Lieutenant Nunn because that is a book that I had never heard of, and I'm super excited to go down that rabbit hole. So thank y'all both so much. I hope that you and your families stay safe and well for the rest of this wild time, and look forward to reading more of both of your work in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good night.